Welcome back, guys. I trust you've been safe. Everybody loves Christmas, or at least most people do. And you would think that because it's Christmas, crime would actually also take a break. But hey, there's a saying that crime does not sleep. And indeed, crime didn't sleep on the eve of Christmas in 1994, where families were gearing up to be with their loved ones in preparation of Christmas, and in so doing, some families and individuals found themselves on board an Air France flight numbered 8969, scheduled to fly from the airport in Algeria to France. But little did they know that they were in for a time of their lives. Some would not make it off the plane. Some would make it off the plane traumatized, but indeed, all of them were scheduled, unfortunately, for a very deadly date with 4 terrorists from an Algerian terrorist group called the GIA Islamic Armed Group. And this was going to be a showdown that would shake the country to its core and also at the same time elevate how formidable France had prepared for these attacks. If you are ready for this true crime story, buckle up and let's go. The Air France Flight 8969 was a regular flight en route to Orly Airport, Paris, from the Houari Boumediene Airport in Algeria, with 236 occupants made up of passengers, crew, and, well, unfortunately, hijackers. The flight was scheduled for December 24th, 1994 to take off at 11:05 a.m. local time. But then, little did most of the passengers and the crew on the flight know what was in store for them. For shortly before takeoff, 4 terrorists who had disguised themselves as Algerian presidential police with blue uniforms with Air Alger logos boarded the plane and blended with the crowd. Coincidentally, the Algerian military had also felt suspicious of noticing that the Air France flight 8969 appeared to have had an unauthorized delay, so they began surrounding the aircraft. Now, that right there, I think, is the hallmark of a top security system. Although one would argue that if they are really on top of their game, how did the terrorists actually get the chance to actually board the plane? I agree, but at least they were able to detect the anomaly within time. Operators from the Algerian Special Intervention Group, the GIS, were present at the scene, and upon seeing the GIS operators gathering outside the plane, one of the terrorists is reported to have shouted, "Tagut." And for those of you who are not aware, Tagut is an Arab word meaning infidel. And immediately he shouted that word, the crew on board just knew that these guys were terrorists, and just like that, they had been drawn into the middle of a terrorist situation without their consent, of course, but they had nothing to do now. At first, other people on board didn't suspect that the alleged security agents got onto the plane and regularly started checking passports. So they were posing as though they were just part of the security crew and they were checking passports to see if everything was in order. I think this was their way of blending with the crowd. So it didn't look suspicious initially, but once that word was shouted, Tagut, then people knew that we are in something more deep than we could even think of. And suddenly, These terrorists pulled out their Uzi and AK-47 assault rifles. Moments later, Air France Flight 8969 was officially hijacked. So just like that, twinkle of an eye, you're on board the plane, going to see your family members reunite with loved ones for Christmas, and just in the blink of an eye, you are in the middle of a terrorist situation where terrorists have hijacked a plane on which you are on board. The trauma alone is terrifying. The terrorists barricaded themselves, and the first thing they did was to prove that they are serious. And how did they prove this? They instantly murdered 2 passengers. They killed first an Algerian police officer and then a Vietnamese diplomat, just to prove to the people on board that they were committed to their cause. And of course, after doing this, who wouldn't listen and obey their instructions? Only 15 minutes later, the French government was notified about the hijacking through their intelligence channels, and the French intelligence agents were therefore already also assigned to monitor Algerian military and police radio traffic, and as such, they found that something was going on at the airport, so they escalated it. And once the escalation got to the French government, the government immediately put their elite counter-terrorism unit called the GIGN on standby, ready to intervene if it necessitated. At a point, the Algerian Interior Minister personally led the negotiations with the terrorists that used the pilot as a go-between, because they knew that they have the leverage, so they decided to use the pilot as a go-between. And after 4 hours of talks, the notorious terrorist group, that's the GIA, they agreed to release some hostages. From the descriptions that the free hostages gave, the Algerian intelligence were quickly able to identify the terrorists, and it included their leader, who was called Abdallah Yahya. The terrorists seemed determined, obviously well planned, and very cold-blooded, because they had already killed 2 people, unprovoked, of course. Nearly 9 hours into the hijacking and hostage crisis, the French government ordered the GIGN to move. A total of 35 GIGN operators took off from Paris to fly to Palma de Mallorca in Spain and wait for further orders. The French government couldn't persuade the Algerian government to accept help from the GIGN. At this point, I'm sure some of you might be wondering, who the hell or what the hell is the GIGN? So I will elaborate. The GIGN is the elite tactical unit of the National Gendarmerie of France, and among its missions are counter-terrorism, hostage rescue, surveillance of national threats, protection of government officials, and targeting of organized crimes. The GIGN, by no means, is a group not to be messed with. It was established in 1973, shortly after the 1972 Munich massacre, which saw the killing of 13 Israeli athletes by Palestinian insurgents in Munich, Germany. The GIGN was initially created as a relatively small tactical unit which was specialized in sensitive hostage situations, but has since grown into a larger force with expanded responsibilities and capabilities. The GIGN is now composed of nearly 1,000 operators, as well as several branches scattered across the country. The GIGN shares jurisdiction of foreign and French sovereign territory with the special response units of the National Police and its training center is located in Bains. Although most of its operations take place in France, the GIGN, which is a component of the French Armed Forces, can operate anywhere in the world. Many of its missions are secret, and operatives are not allowed to be publicly photographed. Since its formation, the GIGN has been involved in over 1,800 missions and has also rescued more than 600 hostages, thereby making the GIGN one of the most experienced counter-terrorism units in the world. So, yeah, their resume is clear. You don't fuck with the GIGN or else they will put you down. And you can see how effective they are. And this is what the 4 terrorists were up against. But then, I'm sure another group watching would also be wondering, who are these terrorist groups? Who are these terrorist groups? And what do they stand for? I will elaborate too. The Armed Islamic Group was one of the 2 main Islamic insurgent groups that fought the Algerian government and army in the Algerian Civil War. This is how they operate. Their major actions include assassinations, massacres, bombings, aircraft hijackings, and kidnapping. Their main goal is to destabilize governments. Notable attacks of theirs: the Taha Jawood assassination, the Jilali Laibs assassination, the Cheb Hasni assassination of 1994, the January 1995 Algiers bombing, the 1995 France bombings, the murder of the monks of Tibirin, and the Luz Matoub assassination. So they also have a negatively impressive rap sheet. So this was a meeting of peers of the opposite sides, one standing to enforce the law, and another standing to push their agenda across through fair or foul means, mostly foul means in this case, and the battle lines were drawn with the occupants of the flight now caught in the crossfires. But it didn't end there. The negotiations were still ongoing, and in as much as France was still making an attempt to get GIGN to fully engage and destabilize the situation, they still had to go through the Algerian government. The day after the hijacking, the terrorists wanted to take off and fly to Paris, but the Algerian security forces weren't willing to let the plane take off. The hijackers threatened to kill a French passenger, and unfortunately, they did, shortly after the Algerian authorities again refused to meet their demands. The French Prime Minister at this time phoned his Algerian counterpart and demanded that the plane take off. And finally, on December 26th, after a 2-day standoff, the aircraft left Algeria and headed for France. So this terrorist attack, the hijacking of the plane, started on the eve of Christmas, 24th December 1994. It went into 25th December after 2 people had already been killed. The standoff and negotiations continued into 26th December, from Christmas Eve to Christmas through to Boxing Day, and another person got killed just to prove a point. So finally, on the same day, the plane carrying the GIGN operators was already headed for Algeria, but because now the terrorists had been given the green light to fly the hijacked plane, they were ordered to head back to where they moved from. So they turned around and made back to Marseille to wait. Additional GIGN reinforcements were dispatched to Marseille. So the number of operators headed to Marseille airport as GIGN GN operatives was a total of 51. The aircraft carrying the GIGN operators fortunately touched down before the hijacked aircraft did. And at this point, plans were being put in place. When the Air France Flight 8969 landed in Marseille, the negotiators immediately started negotiations with the terrorists. As they took their time, GIGN also started planning the daring raid that will skyrocket GIGN as a world-class counter-terrorism unit not to be fucked with on any day. GIGN examined the plane for possible entry points and did the basic check for booby traps. They also placed listening devices on the plane's chassis. The official negotiations still continued for hours, and the terrorists got impatient and at a point wanted to take off again and leave Marseille. In the late afternoon of December 26, 1994, at approximately 16:45 hours, the terrorists had reached their boiling point and they got impatient. They opened one of the plane doors and started shooting at the control tower. The GIGN was given the green light, fearing the terrorists would kill more hostages because they had already killed 3 hostages. And at approximately 17 hours, 3 8-man teams went into action. They approached the aircraft using 3 mobile ramps, but spotted the terrorists who opened fire. Immediately, the first GIGN team went through the front door, and the first 6 operators that went into the plane were injured. So you see, the terrorists were also formidable, and they are ready to die for their cause. So the GIGN knew what they were up against, and they were also strong in their resolve to ensure that they rescue all the victims safely. The other 2 teams went into the aircraft through the aircraft's rear doors, and a heavy firefight occurred, which lasted for only 90 seconds. The first hostages were evacuated alongside the wounded operators. So swiftly, GIGN had secured the first victory. The remaining terrorists retreated to the cockpit, where they were pinned down, and it looked like a final showdown was in place. The GIGN would storm the cockpit, but they decided not to, since the terrorists still had the pilot and a steward in there, and the GING's main motive was to save everybody with little or no casualty. The co-pilot had jumped out one of the cockpit windows when the attack had started. The 2 terrorists continued to exchange fire. The GING operator threw a flashbang grenade through a cockpit window, but the grenade didn't affect the terrorists. Obviously, they had trained for it. During the standoff with the terrorists in the cockpit, and almost 4 minutes from the beginning of the action, all the hostages were evacuated except for the pilot and the steward, who were still in the cockpit. Now, GIGN snipers positioned on the surrounding aircraft and airport building areas were ordered to open fire on the remaining terrorists in the cockpit. The firefight continued for several minutes, and suddenly the shooting stopped. And over the radio, the pilot said that all the terrorists were dead. The 2 remaining hostages, mainly the pilot and his steward, were evacuated from the aircraft, and amazingly, they were both unharmed, even though the cockpit was full of bullet holes. So this is my analysis as to how good the GIGN actually are. If you look at the picture of the plane, and the gunshot holes or the bullet holes that you see, how come the pilot and the steward were unhurt? It means that the GIGN operated with tactical precision and all their shots were accurate. And I think that it's no surprise that they came to be realized or recognized as one of the top counterterrorism units in the world. The part the GIGN raid played during the overtaking of hijacked Air France Flight 8969 was directly broadcasted on national TV. Millions had the opportunity to watch how the GIGN ended this terrible hostage crisis. In the aftermath of this, a 17-minute-long attack had ended successfully, and over 1,500 rounds had been fired, while 4 hijackers were killed. In total, 3 passengers were executed, while 173 people were saved. As a result of the damage to the aircraft, the A300 aircraft was written off, and the crew of the A300 and the GIGN forces received high national honors. Further investigation of the incident led to the conclusion that the terrorists had planned to detonate the aircraft over the Eiffel Tower. How sadistic. That claim comes from the former leader of the militant group. But guess what? After being dealt this severe blow by the GIGN, the Islamic group never attempted this plot again. In total, here is the hijacking results in numbers. There were a total of 236 occupants, including the 4 hijackers. Of these, 224 were passengers, including the 4 hijackers, and 12 of the 236 were actually the crew on board the plane. There were a total of 7 fatalities, of which 3 were passengers killed by the hijackers, unfortunately, and 4 are the hijackers themselves. Now, although 3 people died, I still think the GING were totally on point, because all these 3 people died prior to the intervention of the GIGN. 25 people were injured in total, with 13 being passengers, 3 being crew, and 9 of them being GIGN operators. And there were a total of 229 survivors. We at True Crime Cafe pour our hearts out to any family who lost a member on this plane through this event. And at the same time, whilst we tip our hearts out to GING, we still wish these families the strength to continue. And for forces like the GING and other first responders out there helping to promote safety and protect society, personally, I think that sometimes they are not celebrated enough. We at True Crimes Cafe tip our hearts out to you and we say congratulations. GIGN has come to stay, and it's no wonder that they are among the top in the world. And this daring rescue attempt sets them apart from their peers. If you enjoyed this video, help the channel grow by subscribing to the channel, turning on post notifications, and sharing our content. What do you think of this whole thing? From the rescue attempt, the terrorist attack itself, and the swift intervention of the GING, coupled with even the role the various governments played. Let's have a discussion in the comment section. Stay safe out there.